Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking into something, well, a bit unnerving.
Yeah,
How panic is used as a weapon.
absolutely.
You sent over a document, Fear Factor, Weaponizing Panic in Asymmetric Conflicts. We're going to unpack that.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. It really changes the way you think about conflict,
Yeah.
especially modern conflict.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What makes a conflict asymmetric?
Well, it really boils down to a power imbalance.
Okay.
One side, you can think of David and Goliath.
Okay, yeah.
One side might have tanks and fighter jets, the others relying on guerrilla tactics, exploiting their enemies' weaknesses. It's really not about who has the bigger guns.
Right.
It's who can use what they have most effectively.
So how does panic fit into all of this?
Panic is a weapon.
Okay.
It's a weapon that targets the mind. It's about creating a situation where rational thought breaks down
Right.
and fear takes over. Imagine a crowded theater. Someone yells, "Fire!" It's that chaos.
Stampede.
The stampede. That's the kind of reaction we're talking about. That primal reaction.
Right.
But weaponized.
And in war, that kind of chaos can be induced. Turn a disciplined force into, well, a scattered mess.
Absolutely. And the document highlights several tactics designed to trigger this panic. Ambushes.
Okay.
Ambushes, they rely on that shock
Right.
of a sudden and overwhelming force.
Hit hard and fast.
Yeah, you hit hard, you hit
Yeah.
fast, before the enemy can even process what's happening. It's about more than casualties.
Yeah.
It's about disorienting the enemy, making them question their ability to even fight back.
The document emphasizes that. The speed and intensity of a successful ambush.
Yeah.
It's not even about holding ground. It's about the psychological impacts.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. Disrupting supply lines. That's another tactic the document talks about.
Oh, yeah.
Creating that sense of desperation.
You start to run low on ammo.
Yeah.
You start to run low on food.
Are reinforcements coming?
Are reinforcements coming? You start to wonder, can we even hold out?
Right.
That uncertainty breeds fear. And fear can escalate into panic.
And then there are the IEDs. The document points out it's not just the explosions themselves, it's that psychological toll
Right.
of not knowing.
Not knowing when or where the next one's going to hit.
It's a war of attrition, but on the mind.
It is. It is a war of attrition on the mind. That constant fear, the anticipation, it wears down the enemy's mental resilience.
Right.
It makes them much more susceptible to panic when other threats inevitably emerge.
Okay, so we talked about panic as a weapon in theory, but let's get into some real-world examples. The document highlights the Vietnam War, specifically the Tet Offensive.
Yeah, the Tet Offensive is, it's really fascinating.
It's one of those things I remember learning about in school, the scale of the attacks.
Right.
How they caught everyone by surprise.
It was a surprise, but the real impact was psychological.
Correct.
It was the sheer audacity of the attacks, striking all across South Vietnam, even the U.S. Embassy. It created this widespread panic.
Yeah, if they can hit the embassy.
Right.
Like, where are you safe?
Exactly. If even the embassy isn't safe. And that panic had a ripple effect.
Yeah.
All the way back to the American public.
It made people question whether the U.S. could win.
Yeah, it sowed doubt about the U.S.'s ability to win the war.
And that doubt shifted the political landscape.
Absolutely. And that's what the Tet Offensive achieved. It was a strategic victory.
So even though it was militarily repelled, it achieved a strategic victory by weaponizing that panic. Are there other historical conflicts where we see this tactic used so effectively?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The Soviet-Afghan War.
Okay.
It's a perfect example. You have an outmatched force. The Mujahideen using the terrain and these psychological tactics to wear down a technologically superior enemy, the Soviet army.
So the Mujahideen were fighting in their own country, but how did they use that to their advantage?
Well, the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan became their weapon.
Oh, wow.
They used these hit-and-run tactics, these ambushes, to constantly harass the Soviets. They never gave them a sense of security.
The document describes it as this feeling of being watched, of being hunted.
It was incredibly stressful for the Soviets. They had the firepower, but they could never shake that feeling of vulnerability. And that, more than anything, contributed to their withdrawal.
So the terrain itself, combined with the Mujahideen tactics, became a tool for inducing that panic.
Okay.
The document also mentions the Battle of Mogadishu, Black Hawk Down.
Right, Mogadishu, it's a really stark example. Even elite forces can be vulnerable to panic.
Especially in that kind of chaotic urban environment.
Especially in a chaotic urban environment. It's a battle that really highlights the psychological impact of unexpected events.
I think everyone remembers those images, the downed Black Hawk helicopters. It felt like a turning point.
It was more than just the loss of the aircraft, though. That event, unfolding in a city that already felt like a labyrinth, it intensified the existing anxiety. They were operating in a very complex urban environment,
Right.
facing a determined enemy who used the terrain to their advantage.
Right.
And the downing of the Blackhawks just became a focal point for all the fear and uncertainty that was already there.
So the Battle of Mogadishu, it wasn't a defeat, but it demonstrates how a single event can just amplify that panic. But all these examples are from the past. How are these tactics evolving now?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Technology is changing the landscape of warfare, and the tactics for inducing panic are evolving right along with it.
Okay.
We're talking drones, cyber attacks, deepfakes.
Tools that blur the lines between the physical and the digital battlefield?
Yeah, the battlefield isn't just a physical space anymore. It's
Yeah.
expanded into the digital realm, and that opens up a whole new set of possibilities.
For psychological warfare.
For psychological warfare. Drones, for example, they create this sense of constant surveillance. We've already talked about how powerful that can be, but it goes even further than that.
Okay.
Cyber attacks can disrupt communication, sow confusion, cripple critical infrastructure, and that creates a sense of helplessness and vulnerability.
And then you have deepfakes,
Right.
which can manipulate reality.
They can.
I mean, imagine a world where you can't trust any video or any audio that you see.
It's a form of information warfare that targets our perception of reality.
Yeah.
It creates doubt, it erodes trust, and it makes it incredibly difficult to distinguish truth from falsehood. And that can lead to anxiety and ultimately panic.
So these tactics have gone digital,
They have.
and they've become even more sophisticated
Yeah.
and potentially even more devastating.
It's a trend that raises serious questions about the future of warfare.
Yeah.
And how we can build resilience against these new forms of psychological manipulation.
This has been an incredible overview of how panic is used as a weapon in asymmetric warfare, from historical examples to the modern digital battlefield.
But this is just the beginning.
Yeah.
We need to delve deeper into how these tactics impact both soldiers and civilians, the long-term consequences, and what strategies can be used to counter it.
Stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the weaponization of panic. So we've seen how panic can be a devastating weapon. But so far, we've mostly focused on the tactics themselves. I want to shift gears a little bit, explore how these tactics actually play out, starting with how panic spreads within a military unit.
Oh, yeah. That's crucial to understand. Panic, it isn't just about individuals losing their nerve.
Right.
It's highly contagious,
Especially in that environment.
especially in a battlefield
Yeah.
where it's life or death.
Yeah, so it's not just about one soldier cracking under pressure.
No.
It can spread, like a
Yeah.
ripple effect.
It can. Think about a unit under attack. One soldier panics. Maybe they freeze up. Maybe they start shouting. And suddenly everyone around them is questioning their own ability to cope. They look to each other for cues, for reassurance.
Wow.
And when they see panic in their comrades,
It triggers their own panic.
it can trigger a similar response in themselves.
The document uses the analogy of a virus, which I think is pretty apt.
It's a very fitting analogy, and there's a physiological component to this as well. When someone panics, their body releases these stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and these hormones can actually trigger a similar physiological response in people nearby,
Wow.
even if they aren't directly threatened.
So it's not just mental or
Yeah.
emotional, it's physical.
It's a physical phenomenon that can spread from person to person, and that makes it incredibly difficult to contain.
Okay, that makes
Yeah.
sense. So this highlights why strong leadership is so crucial.
Absolutely.
Someone who remains calm can have a huge impact.
A decisive leader, someone who can project that sense of control, knowing what to do. It can be incredibly reassuring.
In a chaotic
Chaotic situation, they can recognize the early signs of panic, take steps to counter it, whether it's through clear communication, decisive action, or simply projecting that air of calm.
Yeah.
Their actions can have a ripple effect, just like the panic itself, but in a positive direction.
Right. But what happens when leadership is weak or absent?
That's when things can get really dangerous. Soldiers who are uncertain, afraid, lack strong leadership. They're far more susceptible to panic. And that's something that irregular forces exploit.
The document talks about how irregular forces specifically target leadership structures to
Yes.
create chaos.
It's a strategy called decapitation, and it's incredibly effective.
Oh.
By removing the head, so to speak, they disrupt the chain of command,
Ah.
and it creates a situation where panic is more likely to spread.
It's a chilling tactic, but it shows how calculated this is.
It is.
This use of panic.
It's not just random acts of violence. Right.
It's about understanding the psychology of your enemy
Yeah.
and exploiting their vulnerabilities.
So we've been focusing on how panic impacts soldiers. What about civilians? They're often caught in the crossfire, and I imagine they're just as susceptible to panic, if not more so.
Absolutely. The impact of panic on civilian populations is critical to understand. It's often overlooked. Some irregular forces deliberately target civilians to create fear and chaos, hoping to destabilize the government or undermine public support for the war.
If you can turn the population against their own government,
Right.
you've already won half the battle.
You've won half the battle.
Yeah.
And the tactics they use to induce panic in civilians, well, they're often similar to those used against military forces. Surprise attacks, disinformation campaigns, the constant threat of violence,
Yeah.
all designed to create that sense of fear.
The document specifically mentions IEDs and suicide bombings
Yes.
as particularly effective ways to terrorize civilian populations. It's the randomness. It is. It's the randomness, the unpredictability. It creates this feeling that nowhere is safe. And that's the goal, to
Right.
make people feel constantly on edge, living in a state of perpetual anxiety that erodes their resilience
Okay.
and makes them more susceptible to manipulation.
And that kind of fear, that constant stress, can have a devastating impact
Mm-hmm.
on people's lives,
Mm-hmm.
their mental health, their ability to function. It's psychological warfare, but with long-lasting consequences.
It is. It's about breaking down their will to resist, their faith in their government, their sense of community. It's about creating a climate of fear that can persist long after the conflict itself has ended.
So how do people cope with this level of fear and uncertainty?
Yeah.
How do they build resilience in the face of this kind of onslaught?
That's a question researchers have been studying for decades.
Yeah.
And there's some key factors that contribute to resilience. One of the most important is social support.
Okay.
People who have strong social networks, families, friends, communities, they're much better able to cope with stress and trauma.
Having people you can rely on, people who can offer emotional support, it makes a big difference.
It does. It's about not feeling alone, knowing that you have people you can turn to. Another important factor is a sense of agency,
Okay.
the feeling that you have some control over your situation, even in the midst of chaos.
So it's not about being passive.
No,
It's about taking action.
it's about taking action, even small actions, to improve your situation or to help others, even something as simple as helping a neighbor, volunteering, staying informed.
Right.
These things can give you a sense of purpose and control, which helps build resilience.
Okay. So what about information? Does access to accurate information play a role?
It's absolutely crucial. One of the most effective ways to counter fear and panic is to combat disinformation. People need access to reliable sources of information so they can make informed decisions and avoid being manipulated.
So it's about being critical of what you see and hear?
It is. Media literacy is more important than ever in today's world, where information warfare is becoming increasingly sophisticated.
We've covered a lot of ground here, exploring the mechanics of panic, the tactics, how it impacts both soldiers and civilians, and we've touched on resilience.
We have, but our exploration isn't over yet. We need to delve into those long-term consequences
Okay.
of weaponizing panic. What happens after the conflict ends? How do societies rebuild?
How do they heal?
How do they heal? Those are questions with profound implications, not just for the individuals involved, but for the future of entire societies.
Stay tuned as we continue our deep dive into the weaponization of panic. So we spent this deep dive exploring, well, kind of the dark side of warfare,
Yeah.
how panic is used as a weapon, the effects on soldiers and civilians, but what happens when the fighting stops?
Right. How do you rebuild a society after that, after being shattered by fear and violence?
That's a good question. Where do you even begin?
Yeah.
The document mentions security,
Right.
but it's got to be more than just disarming militias and reestablishing law and order, right?
It's much more than that. Physical safety is crucial, of course. But that's just the first step.
Yeah.
People need to feel safe psychologically as well. to believe that the violence is over, that they won't be targeted again, and that takes time.
Especially when the conflict has been fueled by these deep divisions.
Absolutely. When there's this deep distrust, rebuilding that trust is one of the biggest hurdles.
Yeah. It seems like such a daunting task.
It is. It requires a multifaceted approach. It often involves addressing past injustices, holding perpetrators accountable, creating mechanisms for reconciliation.
So it's not just about moving on.
It's not about forgetting the past. It's about finding ways to move forward together.
It's about acknowledging what happened.
Yes.
Seeking justice.
Yeah. Justice is a crucial part of healing. Without a sense that wrongs have been addressed, it's very difficult to build that foundation for lasting peace. But it's not just about punishment either. It's also about creating opportunities for dialogue, for understanding different perspectives, finding that common ground.
Okay, so we've talked about security, we've talked about trust.
Right.
What about the economic impact? How do you rebuild an economy that's been devastated?
Yeah, economic recovery is vital for long-term stability. It means investing in infrastructure,
Right.
creating jobs, providing essential services, healthcare, education.
Yeah.
It's about giving people the means to rebuild their lives and to have hope for a better future.
It just seems like such a massive undertaking, considering the scale of these conflicts.
It is. It requires a long-term commitment from
Yeah.
both the affected government and the international community. But it's not just about restoring what was lost. It's about building back better, creating a more just and equitable society, addressing the root causes of the conflict to prevent it from happening again.
So it's not just fixing the damage, it's about making the society less susceptible to these manipulations.
Exactly. It's a long and challenging road, but it's the only way to really break that cycle of violence and create a future where panic is no longer a weapon of war.
Well, this deep dive has been, well, incredibly insightful, a bit unsettling at times, but it's essential to understand these tactics, their impact, and the challenges of rebuilding afterwards.
What's important to remember is that even in the face of this hardship, human beings are resilient. There's always hope.
Yeah.
There are always paths to healing and rebuilding.
That's a powerful reminder and a hopeful note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the weaponization of panic. We encourage you to continue exploring this topic and to consider its implications for all of us.